Hi, I'm Jennifer Ouellette. I think we have Dr. Michio Kaku on the other side.
How do you do?
Nice to meet you. Um, Welcome. This is Blogging Heads TV. I'm Jennifer Ouellette. I'm a popular science writer, and I also blog at Cocktail Party Physics. And you, of course, are a theoretical physicist at City College and author of several popular books, the latest of which I'm holding up right now, Physics of the Future. And I guess a good place to start is, your last book was Physics of Impossible. You've written about hyperspace. You've written about parallel worlds. What drew you to this particular topic, and why did you decide now to write Physics of the Future?
Well, when I was a child, I had two passions in my life. The first was, Einstein had died when I was a child. Everyone was talking about the fact that he couldn't finish his greatest work, the theory of everything. So I said to myself, that's for me. I want to be part of the greatest chase in all of science, the chase to find an equation 1 inch long that will allow us to, quote, read the mind of God. And that's what I do for a living. That's my day job, string theory. But when I was a kid, I used to always watch science fiction. Saturday morning television had Flash Gordon on, and I was hooked. For the first time in my life, I saw the future. A future of rocket ships, life on other planets, ray guns, and incredible machines. And I said to myself, that's for me too. Now I realize that they're really the same thing. If you understand fundamental physics, you have a good grasp about the future. And that's what Physics of the Future is all about. I've had a chance to interview over 300 of the world's top scientists for the Science Channel, Discovery Channel, BBC Television, and my own radio show, which goes out to 130 radio stations. It's been a real treat being able to pick the brains of the world's leading scientists when I ask them, what are your dreams for 2050, for 2100? Because these are the scientists who are inventing the future in their laboratories. The book is not science fiction. I'm not a science fiction writer. I'm not a historian or sociologist. They write about the future. But hey, let's be real. We all know that it's science that's going to drive the future.
Right. It's interesting you bring up this point about loving science fiction films because, most of us who love science also tend to love also science fiction. There seems to be a really nice give and take between these two worlds. Science inspires science fiction writers, and they in turn, with their visions of the future, inspire scientists to try and make those things a reality. I'm thinking in particular Star Trek, that the flip phone that they had actually inspired the inventor of the cell phone to create that. So I think a lot of what you're talking about is that drive that these kids that grew up on science fiction and loving science became scientists and wanted to make these things real.
That's right. Throughout history, you see science fiction inspiring scientists. For example, back in the 1920s, there was a country lawyer in Missouri, and he was going to be just a footnote in history, but he remembered reading Jules Verne as a child. He quit being a country lawyer, went to Chicago and got a PhD, and became the greatest astronomer of the 20th century, Edwin Hubble. It was science fiction that inspired Edwin Hubble to discover eventually the Big Bang Theory, the expanding universe. All of it because he decided as a child that he loved Jules Verne and wanted to be part of the romance of science rather than be a country lawyer in the Hicks. Time and time again we see that. Also, science fiction sometimes inspires real science. In the 1930s, Leo Szilard, a physicist, was wondering, is it possible to use E equals mc squared, Einstein's famous theory, and harness it, maybe for a weapon, because the Germans were working on it. And he came across H.G. Wells' novel, where H.G. Wells actually predicted the future date when a physicist would discover the secret of the atomic bomb. Well, Leo Szilard said, hey, that's for me. I want to also see whether I can build an atomic bomb. And just on schedule, just like H.G. Wells predicted in a work of science fiction, Leo Szilard figured out the chain reaction process. He was very excited. He wrote to his friend Albert Einstein. Albert Einstein then wrote a letter to Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and the rest is history.
It's interesting. I was looking over some of the topics that are covered in your book, And I noticed that you talk about, among other things, molecular medicine, which is scientists been able to grow organs of the body. And I know that just recently, in the past couple of weeks, there was a demonstration of someone who actually printed a kidney out using printer technology, where they managed to actually create this organ. So even though you're talking about physics of the future, I think we're already seeing, the groundwork being laid for many of these things. I mean, the space elevator seems very futuristic, but people have been talking about it for 10, 15 years.
That's right. You see, the book talks about science in the making today. It's not a work of science fiction. And realize that 100 years ago, Konstantin Tsiolkovsky wrote about the space elevator. That's how old it is. People have been trying to grow organs for many a decade, but only in the last decade or so have people been able to grow skin, cartilage, noses, ears, blood vessels, heart valves, now bladders, and now windpipes, using your own cells. And the book predicts, quoting Nobel laureates like Professor Gilbert at Harvard, that in 20 years or so, most organs of the body will be grown. We'll have a human body shop. So even in science fiction predicts the medicine of the future. Also, there was that cheesy movie called Fantastic Voyage, based on a novel by Isaac Asimov. Everyone laughed because there was Raquel Welch coursing in the blood veins of a human. Well, believe it or not, we're going to have something like that very soon. These are called nanoparticles using nanotechnology. We can now put nanoparticles in our blood that will seek out and destroy cancer cells. This is big. This is real big. Because if you have cancer today, you have to suffer chemotherapy. Your hair falls out, your skin turns parts, you vomit every day. In the future, people will look at chemotherapy like we view bloodletting. You know what killed George Washington? George Washington didn't die in battle or anything like that. George Washington was killed by his own doctors. He was bled to death. Because a long time ago, they thought blood had bad humor, and you had to bleed people when they got sick. Well, in the future, we'll look at chemotherapy let me take that again. So in the future, we'll view bloodletting. Let me take that again. So in the future, we'll look at chemotherapy like today we look at bloodletting.
Yeah, it's interesting that you bring that up because obviously people have been working with nanoparticles for a while now, and I know that gold nanoparticles are something that they've looked at where they sort of embed that and it attaches itself onto the cancerous cells, and then they can burn away. The heat will only affect those aspects where the nanoparticle has attached to the cancerous tumor. That's been shown in the lab. Is that sort of what you're talking about?
Yes, and other things too. It turns out the cancer cells have very large, ragged holes in them, while ordinary cells have very round and smooth and small porous holes. Well, we can design a nanoparticle that is exactly midway in size between a normal hole of a normal cell and a large, raggedy hole of a cancer cell. So you simply circulate these nanoparticles in the blood, and automatically they zero in on the large hole because they don't fit in the small hole of a normal cell. Then you could put gold particles, you could put genes like P53, you could put poisons like chemotherapy in the nanoparticle to zap the cancer cell. So, hey, this already exists because, see, physics of the future is not about science fiction per se. It's about real experiments in the laboratory that are mentioned in science fiction, but they're going to become real.
Mm-hmm. So for you personally, because you've had a chance to get exposed to all these ideas, I'm assuming that because of the kinds of things that you yourself work on, that it's pretty hard to blow your mind. So what, for you, was the most mind-blowing, amazing thing that you heard about in the process of writing this book?
Well, you're right. I do read a lot of things about what's happening in the scientific field, so sometimes I don't get surprised so much. However, I am surprised at the progress, the rate at which these things are happening. For example, let me take two. The internet in your contact lens, yes, is part of science fiction, but who would have thought that we could actually create such a thing? This is going to change everything when the internet is in your contact lens. Already we have prototypes. You put them inside your contact lens, and when you meet somebody, it identifies who that person is. Just like in the movie Terminator, right? Arnold Schwarzenegger, the robot, could see and identify people. So the biography comes out right next to the person, and subtitles. If they speak in Chinese, no problem. The Chinese will be translated, and you'll see the transcription underneath the person. That's coming real fast. Another thing that's coming fast is unlocking the aging process. When I was a child, I read a lot of stuff, and I began to realize that, hey, the fountain of youth is not going to be found in my generation. But I think that maybe the next generation, or maybe the generation soon after that, will have something approaching the fountain of youth. We are, for example, 98.5% identical to a chimpanzee in our genes. That handful of genes separates us from the chimpanzee, but we live twice as long, and we have much, much larger brains. So among this handful of genes are the genes that control the aging process that have doubled the lifespan and also given us the large brain.
So this actually raises an interesting question that several people have, it always seems to come up when we talk about this whole anti-aging, because I'm with everybody else. I don't want to get old. Nobody wants to die. I'm not really in any hurry to shuffle off this motor coil. But if suddenly we manage to reverse aging or stop it or somehow bring in this notion of, of immortality, what does that do to population? What does that do to resources, of which there is a finite amount? I mean, what are the challenges that we will then have to deal with in order to support that growing population?
Well, here's where I think science fiction writers actually got it wrong. Science fiction writers talked about an overpopulated planet. There was even a Star Trek episode about that, I recall. Mm-hmm. And if we live longer, we'll just simply populate the whole planet. Well, the actual reverse process is happening. As we live longer, we have fewer children. Look at Europe. Look at Japan. The population of Japan is actually contracting right now. Japan is the only developed country in the world whose population is actually contracting rather than increasing. We have a large numbers of old people. Very few young people are being born. We're seeing a train wreck in slow motion. And Europe is next. So science fiction writers didn't get it right. You see, if you're a peasant, you do a calculus equation. Every child you have adds to your wealth. More farm hands in the fields if you're a peasant. But if you go to the city and you're urbanized, every child you have reduces your wealth, not increases your wealth. And that's one reason why population and fertility rates have plummeted. I mean, in Japan, it's like 1.2, 1.3 children per family. So as we live longer, become more prosperous, have more money and assets, hey, we want to have fun. Plus, every kid costs money. So people aren't having kids. I think the problem is the opposite. It's an imploding population problem.
Yeah, that's very interesting. That kind of reminds me a little bit of back in the 1800s when Malthus and some of his other folks were coming up with all these equations for population growth dynamics. And Malthus was the one that said it was an exponential growth problem, and he basically just said that the only thing keeping the population in check were natural disasters and famines and things like that. But it turns out he wasn't exactly right. It turns out that somehow nature has a way of self-correcting for these things. Is that kind of what we're seeing here?
Well, Malthus made this prediction, but it didn't come true for a variety of reasons. One, we had this explosion of resources. Humanity began to populate whole continents that were unpopulated, relatively speaking, which meant more natural resources. The New World came in, tremendous bounty of agricultural products. And more recently, we had the Green Revolution. We've had fertilizers. We had a chemical revolution making fertilizers possible. And so we had a bounty of wealth of food. However, it can't last forever, even with biotechnology. And so at a future date, I think we will have to worry about the problem much more carefully, but on a much higher level than Malthus projected. By the way, We're not going to solve the problem of population and food by going to Mars. Let's face it, it'll take centuries to terraform Mars. Mars can be terraformed, but it can't be terraformed overnight.
Yeah, I remember talking to a geophysicist about that, and he was basically saying, it's actually easier to terraform Mars than it is to terraform the moon for a variety of reasons, but it takes hundreds of years, as you say.
Mm-hmm, that's right. And also, space flight is very expensive. It costs $10,000 a pound to put anything in orbit around the planet Earth. That's your weight in gold. So imagine your body made out of solid gold. That's what it costs to put you in orbit around the Earth. $10,000 a pound. To put you on the moon is about $100,000 a pound. To put you on Mars, yeah, we could do it. It would cost $100 million a pound to put you on Mars. That's your weight in diamonds. So yeah, we could do it if you make your body made out of diamonds and finance the cost of putting you on Mars.
Right. You had mentioned the contact lenses and the internet, and of course we already have glasses with the sort of heads-up displays and things like that are very, very real. And increasingly we're also seeing brain implants. We're seeing people, there was that professor who put the camera on the back of his head so he could actually, as part of an experiment. So this augmentation, this cyborg human being is becoming more and more common. We've got artificial limbs now that can be controlled with your thoughts once you train the system. Where do you see that going?
Well, some people are afraid that one day robots will be so intelligent they'll put us in zoos and throw peanuts at us and make us dance behind bars. But as you pointed out, there is an alternative to letting the machines take over. And that is, why can't we augment ourselves? Now, in my book, I mentioned that there's something called the caveman principle. And that is, if you give cavemen fantastic devices and wizardry, sometimes they'll reject it because it goes against their evolutionary instincts. Okay, so who wants to have implants sticking out of our head? Who wants to look like the Borg? Who wants to look like a robot and look uncool if it enhances your intelligence and your strength? So I think in the future people will get over this aversion to augmenting the body if they realize it's cool. It makes them attractive to their peers and to the opposite sex. Then people will say, hey, I want to be enhanced.
Mm-hmm. It was interesting because then you've got this weird, it's no longer us versus the robots, us versus the cyborgs. And that was one of the most interesting things I thought about the film Terminator 4 was you actually had these hybrids. And it was actually kind of a tragic sort of thing where it was supposed to be an enemy. They basically took over a human body and cyborged it, and suddenly it became part of Skynet. And, but he was still human. So I think people, as you say, are still very much afraid of this, but maybe, that's something that over time, as you get more familiar and more comfortable with these sorts of things, people are kind of squicked out by having an implant in their brains. But I think that if you are paralyzed and it's the only way you can communicate, it's the only way you can walk, you'll get over it.
And let's take the Terminator movie. My point of view is that in my book, Physics of the Future, I can date more or less which era in which certain inventions are going to come to be. Now, watching the movie, you think, oh my God, the robots, the internet is going to take over tomorrow. The internet is all powerful, it's going to take over the world. Well, I think that's way further down the line. Now, when you see that robot, though, that can change shape, that shape-shifting robot, you think, wow, that's impossible. We'll never get that in 100, 200 years. Well, actually, it's the reverse. Having conscious internets is actually quite difficult. But creating programmable matter, that's being done right now. And that was also something that was very delightful for me, was actually interviewing the people for the Science Channel that are actually making programmable matter that can change its shape at will, shape-shifting. Now, of course, it's still rather primitive now, but here's how it works. Take chips and make them as small as grains of rice. In fact, make chips the size of molecules. And each molecule or grain of rice has electric charges that you can change because it's intelligent. By changing the charges, they rearrange themselves in different ways. So if you program millions of chips to have charges of a certain way, it will assemble a car. You reprogram it, and instantly the charges rearrange themselves, and all of a sudden you get a chair. So this is the dream of science fiction, the dream of mythology, the dream of the gods, the ability to take an object and turn it into another object just by thinking about it. So the basis is being laid today. People are, in fact, creating chips that are the size of a grain of sand and programming them to rearrange themselves at will. So one day in the future, you'll simply push a button and a city will rise out of the desert.
Wow, kind of like Superman.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it also reminds me of Transformers because they have the robots that can switch. And I have actually seen these sort of shape-shifting robots. They actually have little mini robots that can adapt and change, go under doors, things like that. It's kind of cool.
Yep. And this is programmable matter that you simply will, changing from one form to another.
Hmm. And it's science, not science fiction. Which
That's
is
right. We already
interesting.
have prototypes of this.
Right. I'm sure at some point, because I saw a mention of emotional robots, that you must have talked to Cynthia Brazil.
Yeah, I just met her last week.
Yeah, yeah. I love the work that she's done with Kismet and with other robots. I mean, we saw a talk by her, and what was amazing to me was that not only do we have these robots that show, the first signs of, of actual emotion, but they can reason to a certain extent. They can tell when someone they can understand the notion of lying, for instance. They can understand deception.
When it comes to emotions, I think science fiction writers got it wrong, though. In science fiction, emotions are supposed to be the highest level of human existence. Data, for example, a sentient being trying desperately to understand emotions of human beings. I think that overemphasizes the difficulty of creating emotions. We can create robots today that can mimic social features, emotions of the brain, respond in a way that almost looks human in terms of emotions. But now, what is surprising is we're beginning to understand the necessity for emotions. That in order to create a robot, you really have to have an emotional robot. And this is the reason. If you take a stroke victim, or a person in an accident that severs the connection between the frontal cortex and the amygdala of the brain, where emotions are processed in the center of the brain, if that connection is cut, then you have a person who is totally intelligent, but cannot process emotions anymore. These people are quite interesting because they cannot exhibit normal emotions, except they're fully intelligent. These people have a hard time making simple decisions, value decisions. When should I make an appointment? What should I buy? What is important? What is precious? What is not precious? These people are paralyzed. They can't make the simplest decisions going into a grocery store and figuring out what is important or what is not important. So now we know the purpose of emotions. The purpose of emotions, among many purposes, is to give us value judgments as to what is beautiful, what is ugly, what is expensive, what is not expensive. Without emotions, we're paralyzed. So when you watch Spock on Star Trek, you think, wow, he doesn't have any emotions. He's cold. Wrong. He made value judgments. He joined the Federation. He respects his peers. He will sacrifice his life for the benefit of many. These are value judgments, all of which are emotional. So in other words, Spock is full of emotions. Science fiction writers got that wrong.
So he was also half human, as I recall.
Well,
so that's where those emotions came from.
But the Vulcans in general are supposed to be mechanical. Now we realize that to be unemotional is to be paralyzed. You cannot decide to do anything because everything's the same.
Yeah, that's very interesting because it raises another question about artificial intelligence and why it's so difficult. I was talking to a roboticist named Malcolm MacGyver, and a couple of other people have also told me this, that our physical bodies, in the same way that emotions play a role in this sort of thing, so do our physical bodies. And so once you start putting the AI components inside a robot body and it actually has experiences and a physical nature that's manifest, they were able to see much more learning in terms of the artificial neural network and things like that.
And also,
so there's all these things that we think.
Right. Also, I have a whole chapter on the future of jobs, and it has direct impact on artificial intelligence. Many people say, what is the job market of the future? Do you have to be Bill Gates to have a job in the future? Well, the answer to that comes from artificial intelligence theory. You see, the jobs of the future will be those jobs that robots cannot do. So then the question is, why don't we have robots? What can't robots do? And the answer is quite surprising. Robots cannot do two basic things. Hollywood gets it wrong. Science fiction writers usually get it wrong. Two things that robots cannot do that will be the source of jobs for the future. The first thing that robots can't do very well is pattern recognition. They can see patterns, but they don't understand what they mean. You see an object, they break it up into lines, circles, squares, rectangles, but they don't understand that these lines, circles, rectangles make a chair or a person or a squirrel. They can't identify these things. Second is even more important, and that's the lack of common sense. We know that water is wet, not dry. We know that strings can pull, strings cannot push. We know that sticks can push, but sticks cannot pull. We know that mothers are older than their daughters. We know that animals do not like pain. We know that when you die, you don't come back the next day. Now, let me ask you a question. How did you know that? How
through
do you know
experience.
that strings can pull and not push? There's no line of calculus that says that. There's no line of computer logic that says that strings can pull, strings cannot push. But you say to yourself, hey, that's just common sense, right? Robots don't got common sense. They've never seen string. They've never seen mothers. They've never seen pain. So robots don't understand common sense. Now let me talk about the job market of the future. Among blue-collar jobs, the jobs that will thrive are those jobs that are non-repetitive. Gardeners, policemen, firemen, construction workers. Each job is different. Robots cannot do that. Robots cannot garden. They cannot put out a fire. The second thing is middle-class jobs. The jobs that are going to get wiped out in the future are middlemen jobs, because those jobs involving inventory, bean counting, accounting of finances, they can be done by computer. The things that cannot be replaced in the middle-class white-collar jobs are those jobs involving creativity, leadership, talent, imagination, scientific skills, understanding rock and roll. Rock and roll people will have jobs in the future, even though high-level accountants may be thrown out of job.
Mm-hmm. So I have a question here, because this brings up, I mean, a lot of what we say is common sense. We sort of learned through experience. Well, I guess my question is, if you have a robot with a physical body and outfitted with emotions, and it goes from infancy and acquires these experiences, can it learn common sense?
Well, learning is extremely difficult because computers are quite different from the human brain. Everyone thinks the brain is a computer, but actually that's wrong. Science fiction writers got it wrong there too. You see, a digital computer has a central processor, a Pentium chip, software, programming, Windows. The brain has no programming. The brain has no Windows. The brain has no chip. The brain has no CPU. There's no Pentium chip in the human brain. So what is the brain? The brain is not a computer at all. It's a learning machine. It's a neural network of some sort. It learns and rewires itself every time it learns a new task. Your computer today is just as stupid as it was yesterday, because your computer doesn't learn. But babies, that's what babies do. They learn. And we learn by bumping into things. There was one episode of Star Trek where Data had a daughter, a robot daughter, of course, and the robot daughter learned by bumping into things. And I said to myself, aha, some of the writers of Star Trek got it right. That we think that robots of the future will probably be bottom-up rather than top-down. The top-down approach to robotics did not work. The top-down approach was to get a CD-ROM with all the lines of intelligence in it. You put the CD-ROM into your computer, and all of a sudden your computer says, I'm aware. I understand. I'm alive. I am sentient. That was the dream of 50 years of work in artificial intelligence. Now we realize that we're going to have to make robots that are like a bug and learn to make robots that are bug-like, then robots that are mice-like, robots that are like dogs and cats, and eventually robots like monkeys. We're going to have to go up the evolutionary scale. That's how Mother Nature did it, by bumping into reality and learning.
So out of all the science fiction films and TV shows that you've seen, do you have a particular favorite that you think got, I mean, obviously they're always going to take liberties, but is there one that's your favorite in particular, one that you thought really got it especially right?
Well, first of all, I love watching science fiction. Sometimes I have to grimace. Sometimes I have to say, ugh, when they get all the laws of physics upside down and backwards. However, I just love the special effects. I love that feeling. However, there's one science fiction movie that I love the best that was actually sort of a guide to writing physics of the future. And that movie was called Forbidden Planet, based on a work of Shakespeare called The Tempest. Well, in Forbidden Planet, there's a super-intelligent civilization millions of years ahead of us, and they've created something at the pinnacle of their scientific prowess. That is power without instrumentality. That is mentally controlling objects around you. You want something, you wish for it, there it is. That's the power of the gods, the Greek gods. You'd think that this civilization would be at the height of their scientific power. But then one day, the Krell disappeared, totally vanished. And then monsters invade the spaceships and kill many of the crewmen. So what's the relationship between this machine and all the monsters? At the very end of the movie, they reveal it, and it's quite a shocker. If you've seen that movie, you get quite a shock when you see that movie. It turns out that on the very day the Krell turned on their machine, giving them infinite power just by thinking about it, well, they went to sleep that day. And what do you do when you go to sleep? You dream. And what do you dream about? Sometimes you dream about monsters. And what does this machine do? It converts your nightmares into reality. So the Krell committed suicide, mass suicide, the very day that they were supposed to be at the pinnacle of their power. That's a lesson for us. We're not going to have to wait millions of years to have this power. Within this century, we will have the power of a god. We'll be able to move objects with our mind. We'll have near-perfect bodies, ageless bodies. We'll have chariots that take us everywhere we go, that float in the sky. We'll have them. And we'll have Pegasus. We'll have animals that don't exist on the surface of the earth. We will create them. We will have the power of the gods of mythology. The question I raise is, will we also have the wisdom of Solomon to go with it?
Right, and that was actually one of my questions, that there always seems to be like a double-edged sword aspect, to these amazing things. Have we evolved enough as human beings to have the responsibility of this immense power? Because what is that saying? Power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. So if we have this incredible absolute powers, how are we going to handle that? I think that's the question you're raising here.
That's right. And there's also a corollary. People are sometimes afraid of the future because they see, what happened during World War II with poison gas, machine guns, and atomic bombs. They're afraid of the future because science is a double-edged sword. But they're also afraid of the future because it's the unknown, things that they're not familiar with. And I'd like to look at the following example. When electricity first came out, when Thomas Edison wired up Pearl Street, not too far from where I'm sitting, people said, this is outrageous, it's immoral, it's against the natural order of things, and it's dangerous. Electricity will be in our house. It'll burn houses down. Children, people could get electrocuted by this mysterious electricity. It's going to invade our homes. It's going to be everywhere. It's going to dehumanize us. Well, you know something? The critics were absolutely right. Houses burn down every day because of electricity. Every day. Every day, somebody gets electrocuted. Every day we have wires, mysterious wires in our living rooms next to our children. And you know something? We love it. So science is not mysterious if you understand it. So if you read Physics of the Future, you're not going to be forever, or at least extending the lifespan, mentally controlling objects around you, living in the matrix, living in a holodeck. I mean, what's not to like?
Well, there may be things that we can't anticipate that are not to like, but you're right. On the whole, it sounds pretty good.
Yeah. I mean, I do not want to live like my great-great-great-grandparents did. Even 100 years ago, the only high-tech thing they had 100 years ago was the telegraph. I prefer not to live like that.
Right. I do have an interesting question because, whenever I go to sci-fi conventions and things, people always ask, whether teleportation is going to be possible, whether all these other things are going to be possible. And the best answer I've heard for this came from Jim Kakelios, who wrote The Physics of Superheroes, where he basically said, look, if it has to do with information, we've had an explosion in our ability to, control information and work with that. But when it comes to energy, things like creating a wormhole and faster than light travel, these are all energy problems. We don't seem to have cracked the energy nut yet. And I guess I'm curious as to what you might have found out about future sources of energy.
Well, first of all, when you take a look at progress, you have to measure it in terms of decades, centuries, when certain energy realms open up. When you start to talk about things like invisibility, lightsabers, ray guns, things that you see in Flash Gordon or Buck Rogers, we'll have most of that within this century. By the time we attain what is called Type 1 status, by the time we're a planetary Type 1 civilization, we will have most of the gadgets, gizmos that you see in a lot of science fiction movies. Beyond that will be Type 2 civilization, handling the power of a star, and that's Star Trek. Star Trek would be a typical Type 2 civilization, a stellar civilization, a civilization that can control a handful of stars, but not much more. Beyond that will be Type 3, will be galactic, like the Empire of The Empire Strikes Back, or the Borg of Star Trek. But in my book, I say, hey, when can we use this power to warp space and time, to create time machines, to create wormholes, gateways to higher dimensions? Well, that's what I do for a living. That's my day job. I work on something called string theory. String theory exists at an energy scale where you can play with the fabric of space and time itself. I work with wormholes. I work with higher dimensions. I spend most of my adult life working in 11 dimensions, 10-dimensional hyperspace. These are the vistas opened up by string theory. And if you want to know more about that, you can get my previous book, Physics of the Impossible. By the way, I have to go because I have a class literally in 5 minutes. So unfortunately, I have to run. Sorry about that.
Okay. All right. Do we have time for one more question?
One, and then.
Okay, because we had a question over Twitter. Someone wanted to ask you about your discussion with Deep Chopra about teleportation and entanglement. They felt that that you got some of that wrong, and they wanted to know what you had to say about that.
Well, I cannot answer that until you tell me exactly what the criticism was.
Yeah, I hope we have time for this, but I think that the thing was about the quantum consciousness sort of thing, and you had described an experiment where they had teleported an atom. And this is something that I get called on a lot, too, as a science writer, that what you're actually teleporting is information. You're changing the state of the atom. And apparently that did not come across. And so I guess that was the question that we got on Twitter that someone wanted to ask, how you would talk about entanglement and quantum teleportation with regards to the notion of consciousness. That's something that physicists in particular, I think, tends to make them go, eh.
Okay, let me address it real quick, okay? And then I literally got to leave.
Yeah.
Okay. In teleportation, we can teleport individual atoms, cesium atoms, rubidium atoms, and also particles of light, photons. Now, technically speaking, we are teleporting the information of the atom rather than the atom itself. But you see, all particles are identical. They're indistinguishable. This is one of the postulates of the quantum theory. Given two electrons, there's no such thing as a green electron. There's no such thing as a brown electron. Electrons are electrons. I can shuffle them around. They are all identical. So if I simply change the state of one electron and move that state over to another electron, then it is indistinguishable from actually moving that electron. And so technically speaking, quantum teleportation teleports information. But if I teleport Captain Kirk, not only do I teleport the information of Captain Kirk, all the personality quirks and whatever, but the new object is identical, quantum mechanically indistinguishable. No experiment can tell the difference between you and your entangled twin. So when we say we teleport an atom, technically speaking, we're teleporting intelligence, but it is indistinguishable from the real thing. Okay, unfortunately, I got to go.
Okay, excellent. I appreciate your time.
Yep. Okay.